This is my final project for the LD ST 322 with Professor Manny Nolet. And one of the interesting things I think about this class for me was the class asked us to look at ourselves and our leadership styles, and we were able to read through many different leadership styles and then try to, in large part, I felt, internalize where we sat as a leader and what we believed our own leadership style to be. And one of the things I thought I would tackle in the final project was what others, how they see me as a leader, being not only a law enforcement officer for 28 years, but I spending 8 years in the Iowa Senate, and now of course being mayor, and look at how they look at me as a leader. I thought was an interesting thing, not only for myself to see how others see me, and maybe help me grow, maybe learn something about myself, but as a different perspective to what we've learned in this class. So I've chose 4 different people who I thought would have a well-rounded idea and thoughts and perspective on how they see me as a leader in so different ways. The first one will be Jeff Bunn. Jeff is a chief of police of State Center, Iowa. And while I've known Jeff as a law enforcement officer over the years, I am now his boss. Being the mayor, I'm in charge of the police department, fire department, and all the other departments that the city runs: electrical, water, sewer, roads. And so, you in some respects taking off one hat, putting on another hat. So I wanted some idea of how he has perceived me as a leader, different from being a law enforcement role, and how this has all either not worked or worked for him here at the City of State Center. Jeff, so before we came on here, I let you look a little bit at exploring leadership and some of the leadership styles that we've talked about this year in this course. And so you've had a chance to sort of look through them, and my question to you is, which one or more than one that strikes you that I would fall under as a leader?
Well, I think the one that I picked is authenticity, and I look at that for the reason of just your approach on how, when you came in as mayor, how you had so many great ideas that you set into place and plans. And one of those plans was that for 21 years, I've been trying to get a second officer hired on in the department, which was a much needed thing. You knew that just from being not just a mayor, but a deputy. But as soon as you became mayor, that became a reality and a must in your mind. And within a 3-month period of time, we had a second officer. I worked with multiple mayors over the years, and they all had great agendas that they were working on. Some would be historical, some housing, some just on budgetary issues. But you're looking at a long distance plan on the city and improving it for growth. But with that, I mean, in 3-month period of time, getting a second officer was amazing. And to get that done by showing the leadership to the council and letting them know that this can be done and that we could find the money to do it, and that was taken care of. If it wouldn't have been for you, I think I would still be battling trying to get that position. Leadership that you showed was not only for the police department, and for me, and I can remember your exact words, you help Marshalltown be there, stay there as long as it takes, and as long as they need you, you need to be there for them. And them as a neighbor, that's how you explained it to us, that we're going to help our neighbors, and because they would do it for us. And not only did you work with the police department, but then you also got the city crews and public works and street department and our utilities department to organize and go over to Marshalltown and help. And not only were you doing that, but then you were also giving just help from behind the scenes by talking to us and letting us know that we're doing a good job and making sure that we're all okay mentally. And because obviously it was a traumatic event, and you wanted to make sure that we were all okay, and that leadership made us feel strong. Well, between 1 and 10, I guess I'm kind of biased, but I would rate you at a 10 because just the pure fact that you can get a job done that hasn't been done for 21 years. It's even been longer than that to have a second officer. I mean, this department had 3 full-time officers at one time, clear back as far back as the 50s, and to come in from January to March 1st and get that done. I mean, that takes grit.
My next interview was with Jeff Hutton. He was the Times Republican chief editor, and the Times Republican covered my Senate district. So Jeff, over a 4-year period of my 8 years of being an Iowa senator, had to cover me both on the political scales, but a lot of local issues, and would come to a lot of my listening posts and ask very in-depth questions about either policy or what were the Senate Democrats doing on a whole host of issues. So I thought getting his perspective as a journalist of how he saw me be a politician and a senator, I guess, in this area, and a leadership and community leader would be an interesting perspective. Styles, and then we'll talk a little bit too about grit. So Jeff, I'll kind of turn the question over. You've had a chance to look at the leadership styles. Where do you think, from working with me, I fit within the leaderships?
I think it varies, quite honestly. If you look at the different choices that were presented, I can see where, Steve, you fit into maybe one of 3 different categories: situational, influence, and reciprocal. In my time in working with you when you were both as a state senator and currently as a sheriff's deputy, I think the situational leadership is obvious because you're dealing with a lot of folks who are in vulnerable positions. In the state senate, you're talking about district residents who maybe feel that they're not getting a fair shake out of government. And so you understand instinctively that, okay, I need to approach this person with kid gloves, or maybe they're very aggressive and I need to be much more firm. So depending on the situation, whether it's about influencing them to change their mind or to convince them that, hey, things are going to get better, I've seen you in both of those positions, or in both situations. So situational is clearly one of those areas where I think you excel. In terms of influence, I looked at the definition in some respect in terms of this idea of charisma. There's no question. Before I even met Steve, I will tell you that one of the things that impressed me, and that was in talking with a lot of people, because it was several months before I actually had a conversation with Steve after I became the editor of the newspaper here in Marshalltown, was to know Steve Sodders is to understand a guy who has a lot of charisma. He can schmooze the enemy, and that's what makes him effective as a state senator or even as a sheriff's deputy. And it does take some of that, because you're talking about a person who deals with different personalities all the time. And so Steve knows when to turn on the charm. He knows when to back off. And if he can find, in terms of his leadership skill, he understood if he could find some common ground between himself and someone who maybe was on the other end of the perspective of a perspective in terms of an issue or a situation where maybe it's Republican versus Democrat, maybe it's a combative person that needs to be served a warrant. Charisma comes into play, and I think that's part of it. So influence is definitely part of it. And then finally, reciprocal. There's no question about that. I think you recognize, Steve, that if you could get someone involved in the process, say you have an idea, but you turn it into a situation in which you convince the people that you're dealing with that this is as much about them as it is you. They then all of a sudden had a leadership role in whatever the case may be.
Grit, as far as our reading, was talent times effort equals a skill, and then skill times more effort gets you to an achievement. How would you, first of all, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, the grittiest, like Mr. Grit, and 1 being pretty passive, where would you place me on the grit scale?
Well, let's be clear. 1 is not not passive. Even on issues that maybe you aren't as well adept to or have a knowledge base about, that's not going to be you. I think, again, it depends on the situation, but clearly I think 10 being the grittiest, if you will, I think there's many times where you fall at number 10. Steve, I think you have some natural talents in terms of leadership and getting things done and making goals met, or reaching goals, I should say. But I think you also recognize that that even though you maybe have, and I don't know if you recognize it yourself, you may say, hey, listen, I don't know that I'm that talented at whatever, but you do work hard. So there's no question about the work ethic coming into play. But even if, and again, even after 8 years in the Senate, where you knew your skill set was pretty well defined by that point, you knew what you could do and how to approach different people. And so some would say, okay, well, there's the talent. He recognizes that, and he can just roll with it. But you didn't take that for granted, and I think that was the difference. You didn't rest on that, and so you were just as much of a pit bull. And I think that term came up many times, from what I understand in talking to different people before I even met you, that hey, Steve Sodders is a nice guy, but he's a pit bull. So if you want something done, you got to talk to you got to deal with Steve. And so,
how do you think that affects both talking about the leadership style and then grit? How do you think we haven't really talked about followers, and of course I don't particularly like the term followers because I feel like it's indenturedness or something. But how do you think when people look at, and you've described some of what you feel my leadership style is, and grit, how do you think followers see that? Well, how do I get things done, maybe? Because I certainly don't do them all myself.
First of all, I don't think in terms of when the folks that you were dealing with, whether, again, it was with your role as a state senator or as your role as a sheriff's deputy, that those folks who maybe would have been perceived as followers, I don't think you would have ever said that they're followers. In fact, I think you would have said, listen, I think these guys are just as interested in the process or whatever the end goal is, because maybe they may be more observational, and then they can fully participate in as to what needs to happen. Folks who may have been perceived as followers, I think you would actually try to get them involved. What can they contribute? Even if it's something small or what would seem to be most people as insignificant. You knew that, okay, that may be their skill set. Like, okay, I can at least get him or her to do this or that. So that, in a way, was reciprocal leadership coming into play, saying, okay, I know you're not just wanting to be here and just, look good for the cameras. I know you want to be part of it. So you actually direct them and say, hey, why don't you try this? And can you do this? I mean, one of the things that that you're really good at is being able to discharge different duties to different people. In part because, one, you knew what their skills were because you recognized those. And two, you also recognize there are areas where maybe you weren't as successful. And so it would make sense for John Doe to do this?
Meeting with Mark Smith. I was able to catch up with Mark at his house. Mark is the minority Democratic leader of the Iowa House. He has been in the legislature as a representative for Marshalltown for 21 years. He was a licensed social worker, still is a licensed social worker, and still does that on occasion, but he is currently trying to, of course, run all the state races currently. But he was also one of the inspirations and the reason I got into politics and ran for the Iowa Senate. So in that respect, I figured it would be a good way to see how Mark perceives my leadership that he has seen from the outside as well, because we'd worked in two different chambers. So we sometimes didn't always agree on everything because the two chambers just don't always agree, but how we work through those things.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to say a word about putting people into categories. That I'm a mental health professional and have diagnosed a good number of people through the years, and no one seems to always fit a diagnostic criteria exactly. And as I look at the list that is in the textbook that has all of the different styles of leadership, I don't think any one necessarily fits you, nor do I think it would fit anyone else completely. So that being said, as I looked at the list, I'm trained as a social worker in systems theory, and so I was kind of drawn to the system theory one for that reason, but think that that does apply to you. And then the second one was the authentic leadership. And a lot of times when I'm recruiting candidates to run for the Iowa House, I will say this: there's no substitution for genuineness. Either you've got it or you don't. And if you don't have it, get out of the way and let somebody else run for public office. So that one to me fit the most with the no substitution for genuineness. But one comes to mind, and that's that several years ago, the legislature promoted and passed legislation that requires state boards to be gender balanced and politically balanced. So like the Board of Social Work that I served on had to be politically balanced and gender balanced. And you felt that there needed to be that same requirement on local boards. And so I don't remember now if you introduced the legislation or where the legislation came from, but I know it got assigned to a committee, and from that committee got assigned to you as a subcommittee, and that you shepherded that legislation all the way through. And of course, there always is opposition to that. For example, on the state level, we always have trouble finding Democratic funeral directors, that they tend to be Republican as a group, and so it's difficult to fill all those balances. And so you started getting the opposition to the legislation from that standpoint that we have trouble getting people that would meet that representation. So it's easy when you're trying to do something progressive to throw your hands in the air and stop doing that. You didn't do that. You kept going with it all the way through the process. You kept listening to all sides, and I thought came up with a really good, that I thought showed your authenticity arrangement where if the board isn't able to meet the criteria for a certain length of time, then they can go with someone else serving on that board.
Difficult for me is one of the things we had to do is I had to sort of internalize what kind of leader do I think I am, which is why I'm doing this project, to see what others think of my leadership, because it's always a little more tougher to look at least more tough to look at how others view you, because you don't really know in a lot of cases.
Right.
Well, the other thing we talked about was grit. So grit is sort of defined as taking some sort of talent times effort equals gets you to a skill, and then taking that skill plus more effort gets you to an achievement. And on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being sort of the lowest kind of grit you can get, to 10, where would you place me on the grit scale?
Okay. I think you're at 10 on the grit scale. Let me go back and just mention something about systems theory, that you made those changes in legislation through a very time-honored system where bills are introduced, they're sent to a committee and dealt with that way. So I wanted to put that plug in for systems theory here as well. But on the grit, again, what I said about it's easy with legislation to throw your hands up in the air. There's always a certain number of people that don't want anything to be done, especially progressive causes. And so you could have thrown your hands up in the air, but you had the grit, you had the determination. I often say that in any good employee situation, and this would qualify for supervisors and managers as well, that we're always looking for them having the education to do the job, having the skills to do the job, and also having the insight to do the job. That in my work in mental health, we've often rehearsed how a therapy session would go, and then you get into the session and it's completely different than what you expected it to be. Then you have to rely on the insight of the person to do that. So I like the quote from Richard Nixon that the role of a postage stamp is to stick to the goods until they're delivered. And you showed that ability.
Last interview for this project is going to be with Carlos Portes. Carlos came to America at the age of 10 under Project Peter Pan from Cuba. He was brought to Marshalltown, grew up here, and then went off and started his own business. And then he became the special ambassador to Latin America and Cuba under President Jimmy Carter. He also went to work for all the other presidents as an advisor up through Obama, including working on the opening of trade with Cuba. And I thought because of his background and the things he and I worked on when I was in the legislature for trade with Cuba, he would also have maybe an interesting take on leadership styles, being around all those different sort of leaders through time, both Democrat and Republican.
Well, I think your leadership styles are kind of unique because you have an array of things that make you kind of, again, unique. You have passion, you have knowledge, you know how to bring people together, you're focused, you're energetic, and you are result oriented. And your results are not your results unless they are the results you are hoping to get. And you always have a way of achieving that because of your persistence. If you're known for something, is that when Steve locks onto something, he doesn't let go until he accomplishes it. And I think those are very unique qualities. When you see other leaders, you see them sometimes surrounding themselves with people that have all of these capabilities, and that's what makes it look good. But when you have one person that can do all of it, inspire, lead, show compassion, understanding, and then the effectiveness, that's a pretty powerful combination. And I'm not saying that in any way, shape, or form other than it is my sincere assessment.
Getting people to follow sort of either an idea or a policy that I would fight for.
Well, I think it all starts with motivation and inspiration. People who follow because they're inspired, and they feel that whatever you're advocating is something that agrees with their convictions, it agrees with their passion, with their Christianity, with their beliefs, whatever that is. Mm-hmm. And then you have people that say, you know, I would like to get in Steve's camp. And you are someone that looks to aggregate and to build on those blocks one at a time. So you always reach out to everyone in your tent, in your camp, regardless of what walk of life they come from. And that, again, makes you kind of a unique leader, because you basically have built enough a large tent in your life in the different roles that you've played, from a state senator to a community leader to mayor of a state center now. And those are things that are extremely gratifying when you're able to take a leadership role to improve, at the end of the day, what is life for communities. Well, since I was raised here originally when I came from Cuba, I always felt a great deal of gratitude to Iowa. And I came back thinking that while I was going to be retiring, I wanted to see what I could do to benefit the state that had given me so much. And by pairing with you and joining you, I felt that Iowa was a perfect opportunity to take the lead in the country in creating a piece of legislation that basically advocated for trade with Cuba, as we had done with China, with Poland in the Cold War days. Mm-hmm. Iowa has always been known. I don't think that Governor Branstad today would have had the relationship with Xi Jinping if he had not met Xi Jinping when he had not even reached the level that he's at. And this is how relationships are built. And I felt this was something that could benefit Iowa across the spectrum. And so we were able to put a piece of legislation, which was the first one in the country that you were successful in putting through the Senate, and being the first state in the country to basically create a trade policy towards Cuba of open trade across the spectrum: agriculture, energy, machinery and equipment, and so on. So again, that was whenever you're the first at doing something, there's a lot of credit to be given for the foresight.
So it's grit, which is some talent. It could be anything, right? But everybody has some talent, but it's what they do with the talent, right? So it's talent times lots of effort equals a skill. It kind of gets you to a skill, and then taking that skill, applying more effort to get to an achievement, or to, that's sort of how you get to the grit. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being sort of little grit, and 10 being very gritty, where would you place my leadership or my grittiness?
I would say that in some areas you could probably be a 10 because of how hard you work. I think if we looked on the average, it would be between an 8 and a 9, simply because you wanted to leave room for continued improvement. But I think that it's undoubtedly once you believe in something, you do it. And I have yet to see you not achieve something that you have set out to do that you have not accomplished. I mean, after your period in the Senate, you decided that you were going to run for mayor, and away you went. And now you're pursuing something else, and you're constantly moving forward to see how you can benefit the community at large, the county at large where you live. And I think you're highly respected by all sectors, regardless of political ideology. They have to hand it to you because you're known to be, quote unquote, the hardest worker out there when they set their mind to do something. And so when you have someone with that level of determination, that is grit. When you have someone with conviction, that is grit. When you have someone that doesn't let go until they accomplish or achieve the goal, that's grit. Say that probably Bill Clinton. And I would say that because there is no leader that does not face adversity. And the key to leadership is, how do you deal with adversity and at the same time lead? And the ability to compartmentalize things when you are in this business of politics and community and so on, is your ability to deal with that set of issues that invariably are going to come up. And now the question is, how do you handle and not lose the focus from the eye on the ball? And that can never be lost, regardless of how many things are being thrown at you. So it's almost like you're going through this trial period where all these things are being thrown at you to see if you can get derailed. And the key here is, as long as you know what your ultimate objective is, you stay focused on that objective, and nothing can deter you from that, regardless of what adversity, regardless of what challenges, regardless of what roadblocks are thrown at you or you come up on, that you never give up and you continue pursuing that goal.
In conclusion, I think this has been a great learning experience for me, both in this class, talking about what we've learned in Exploring Leadership by Coves, and I'll probably end up reading the entire book because I think it's there's a lot of good stuff in here for me to continue to grow as a leader. But also Grit, which by Angela Duckworth, which I talked about and throughout my video presentation for this final project to get some idea of what others or how others see me. So that is my project. I hope you enjoyed my 4 guests: Jeff Bunn, Chief of Police at State Center; Jeff Hutton, who is the editor of the Times Republican and journalist for almost 30 years; Representative Mark Smith, who's the minority leader in the Iowa House here in Iowa; and then finally Special Ambassador Carlos Portes. Thanks.